My personal connection to that theme is that during my therapeutical work in the clinic with drug addicts and alcoholics, there was part of the staff of my colleagues were trained in humanistic methods, and so I was between two focuses. Humanistic psychology is a generic term used to describe several psychological movements such as client-centered therapy, Carl Rogers, Gestalt therapy, Fritz and Laura Perls, existential therapy, Rollo May, and theme-centered interaction, Ruth Cohn. These movements agree in a view of man which emphasizes creativity, responsibility, self-actualization, and psychic health. In the 1960s and 70s, humanistic psychology was very influential in America and later on in Europe. Abraham Maslow and James F. Bugenthal, two important members of the American Association of Humanistic Psychology, founded in 1962, called it a third force in psychology, distinguishing itself from traditional psychoanalysis and behaviorism. Erich Fromm is often considered as a founder of humanistic psychology, although he was never a member of the American Association of Humanistic Psychology, nor was he ever present at their meetings. In the decade between 1955 and 65, he used the term humanistic to delineate the difference between his own thinking and Freud's orthodox version of psychoanalysis 20 years earlier in a paper on the determination of psychic structure by society. He had made it very clear that he did no longer agree with Freud's biological libido theory and his concept of todestry. Critical comments on Freud's naturalistic and pessimistic view of human beings were common to all humanistic psychologists. Fromm was one of the first authors in the USA who brought these views to the public. Nevertheless, he never gave up his fundamental psychoanalytical orientation. Karen Horney, Harris Stack Sullivan, and Erich Fromm were called neo-Freudians because of their revisionist interpretation of Freudian theory. It was very important that Fromm widened the psychoanalytical theory of character formation by historical, socio-economic, and cultural factors. But he was not only a psychosociological theorist, but also a reformer of practical therapeutic treatment. Following Sandor Ferencz's variations in psychoanalytic techniques, Fromm made no longer use of the couch, but preferred a face-to-face relation with his patients and a more active mode of therapy. I think he left this mode of therapy behind him earlier in the 30s. He was convinced that the therapist should learn about his own feelings as well as the patient. There should be a central relatedness between two adult persons instead of interpreting transference from patient's childhood. Fromm was not the only one who criticized Freud's rule of abstinence in therapeutic treatment. Most of his practical postulates were shared by humanistic psychologists. When he wrote To Have or to Be, Fromm said that he had decided against speaking of humanistic psychoanalysis because this attribute was adopted by a group of psychologists with whom he did not agree. Although there was some convergence, he could not share all assertions and practices in HP. I think it was the function of the unconscious thoughts, wishes, and emotions which Fromm tried to reveal according to Freud and many other psychoanalysts. In contrast to him, some protagonists of HP declared that one could neglect the unconscious if awareness was extended beyond daily routine. I am not quite sure if this was the main point, but I think that Fromm saw more the differences with humanistic psychology when their theories were pointed out. In the following, I first will describe some biographical connections between Fromm and other founders of humanistic psychology, and then I will deal with what were the similarities and differences in their theories and practices. Abraham Maslow was a visionary psychologist and main protagonist of the humanistic psychology movement. As he suggested and taught a psychology of being, 1968, psychologists and therapists should give more attention to a health and growth psychology than to a deficiency psychology, which has its focus on disturbances and faults impeding the development of a fully functional person. Maslow was primarily a theorist and researcher, not a practical therapist. The most famous part of his writings is the hierarchy of needs, which he described in his book on motivation and personality. It begins by fundamentally physiological needs like eating, drinking, sleeping, goes over to higher and specifically human needs like love, self-esteem and support by others, and ends by self-actualization intended by persons who wish to fully realize their human capabilities. Abraham Maslow was influenced by Erich Fromm and other neo-Freudian therapists. Between 1935 and 40, he became to know and study with Alfred Adler, who at that time lived in New York. He had many conversations with Erich Fromm, Karin Horney, and other psychotherapists who promulgated a more culturalist interpretation of psychoanalysis, and with the anthropologists at Columbia University, especially Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. At the same time, he became acquainted with Kurt Goldstein and Max Wertheimer, which were two representatives of Gestalt psychology. Like Fromm, they were Jews and left Europe because of the persecution by Nazi regime. Kurt Goldstein was a psychiatrist and pioneer of brain research. In his famous book On the Organism, he spoke of a self-actualizing tendency in the human organism, an expression which was taken over by Fromm. Maslow and Rogers. I don't know if Fromm ever met with Goldstein when both were living in New York, but I'm sure that he knew his book, of course he quoted it, and esteemed his work. Erich Fromm, in my opinion, was the first philosophically reflecting therapist in the 20th century who made use of the term humanistic to point to a certain psychological position. In Man for Himself, he wrote about humanistic ethics, and in The Sane Society and the Art of Man, he used the term humanistic psychoanalysis as a distinguishing mark from orthodox Freudian psychoanalysis. Abraham Maslow was very impressed by Fromm's books. In his own writings, he referred to Fromm, especially to his idea of a self-actualizing tendency underlying human growth and productivity. Maslow's decision that the third force in psychology should be called humanistic, the alternative was existential, was a tribute to Fromm. Another pioneer of humanistic psychology was Rollo May, who was better known as a founder of existential therapy. Fromm got in touch with him at several times. May contacted Fromm to be analyzed in the 30s, but this therapy was broken off after a few months. Some years later, Rollo May joined the teaching staff of the William Alanson White Institute. As colleagues, they could better get along with each other. May said that Fromm's contributions to the discussions of the staff were refreshing because Fromm went beyond therapeutic techniques and spoke with verve of the meaning ground of human life. Quotation from the biography of Friedman. Nevertheless, the distrust resulting of his failed therapy did not cease totally. May's therapeutical system was based more on existential philosophy than on neo-psychoanalysis. Buber and Tillich were more important for him than Fromm. I suspect that there was some kind of rivalry between Fromm and May, even if they respected each other as colleagues with a common humanistic theoretical background. A third founder of humanistic psychology, to whom referred at several times, was Carl Rogers. I'm not quite sure if he was analyzed by Fromm or not, but that goes on.
I'm not quite sure too. No.
Yeah, okay. We had a discussion about potential analysis, Rogers with Fromm, but it's not verified yet. Rogers did not deal with the unconscious and transference or counter-transference in therapy, but his work was clearly stimulated by the ideas of Rank and Buber concerning lived experience and the relation of me and you in therapy. In 1961, Rogers published his most influential book On Becoming a Person, including his theory of the self as an organizing principle in the process of forming and reforming one's own capabilities and actualizing tendencies. He made evident that there are core conditions of successful therapeutical intervening: congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. Later on, Rogers joined the Center for Studies of the Person in La Jolla, California, and began to work with encounter groups and partnership training. As he was also engaged in school reform and peace movement, he was one of the most prominent proponents of humanistic psychology in USA in the late 20th century. I don't know if Fromm and Rogers ever had a meeting, but I'm sure that Fromm took note of Rogers' therapeutical method because he made some comments on it. They had certainly, Rogers and Fromm had some congruent opinions on personal growth as an actualization of human potential. They had correspondent ideas about therapy as a core-to-core relationship of two adult persons without regression to early childhood. But Fromm did not know Rogers' method very, very well, and his comments on client-centered therapy were superficial. Finally, he disapproved grouped therapy. In my next chapter, I will quote some remarks on Rogers which Fromm made in his late writings. There are some German Jewish psychoanalysts who in America got into contact with Erich Fromm before they joined the humanistic movement in psychology. During his formative period at Berlin, Friedrich S. Perls was a follower of Wilhelm Reich. At the beginning of the Nazi regime, he went to Amsterdam, and some years later he lived in Johannesburg as a training analyst of the South African Institute of Psychoanalysis. Laura Perls, who in Frankfurt had studied Gestalt psychology, helped him to write Ego, Hunger and Aggression, a book in which Freud's libido theory was criticized. Fromm knew his book and partly agreed with its unconventional interpretation of psychoanalytical theory. When Fritz and Laura Perls came to New York, he gave support to them by referring some patients. Fritz Perls was asked if he would work as a training analyst at the William Allen White Institute, but Perls did not accept this offer. Together with his wife and Paul Goodman, he called the New York Gestalt Institute into being. It was based on the premise that an effective therapeutic method should not work merely as a talking cure, but in a more holistic or organismic way, including bodily expressions. In the late 60s, Fritz Perls was a very famous group therapist and a guru at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. I think that Erich Fromm got to know about Perls' later career by hearsay, but he never met him again. Ruth Kohn was another German psychoanalyst who met Erich Fromm in New York. Born in Berlin in a Jewish family, she left Germany in 1933 and went to Zurich. And in 1941, she left Europe with her husband and little daughter and came to New York. Her husband tried to complete his medical studies by a psychoanalytical training at the Washington School of Psychiatry, later called William Ellison White Institute, and his training analyst was Erich Fromm. As the family situation was complicated and tensions were increasing, Ruth Kohn wanted to have a therapeutic meeting with her husband and Fromm, but Fromm refused to do so. Her husband's analytical training was broken off and she was divorced. Ruth Kohn later said that Fromm should have been more helpful in this situation. Although discussions with the couple were unusual at that time, the William Ellison White Institute was progressive in testing new methods. That was her argument. In spite of Fromm's refusal, Ruth Kohn was very impressed by the writings of Harris Stack Sullivan and the therapeutic engagement of Clara Thompson, and she admired Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, who was practicing intensive therapy with psychotic patients at Chestnut Lodge. The neo-Freudian orientation of the William Ellison White Institute was very influential on Ruth Kohn's own therapeutic work. Point 3, Fromm's comments on humanistic psychology. As I said in the beginning, Fromm, in his own writings between 1955 and 64, used to speak about humanistic psychoanalysis. He avoided the term humanistic psychology. This is significant because Fromm always was a psychoanalytical thinker. Other therapists who primarily were trained in psychoanalysis later on changed their theoretical foundations, as Fritz and Laura Perls did by Gestalt psychology. It is not surprising that Fromm, in his late manuscripts entitled Steps to Being, said that he had given up the attribute humanistic because this word, quotation, had been used by a group of psychologists whose assumptions I could not share. In his article on Freud's model of man and its social determinants, 1970, Fromm pointed out that Freud's theory of human motivations merely was based on physiological needs and drives, whereas Marx and Goldstein thought that the realization of human potential was the driving force in human life. He added that Maslow had popularized this idea in motivation and personality. Some years later, Fromm's comments on Maslow were more critical. In The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, he said that Maslow, when he was enumerating human needs unsystematically, he failed to derive them from their origin in human nature. I look to you as a guarantee for Fromm's ideas. According to his own theory in the Sane Society, there are 5 existential needs rooted in human nature: relatedness, transcendence, rootedness, identity, and frame of orientation. All needs can be satisfied in an alternative mode: relatedness by love or narcissism, transcendence by creativity or destructiveness, and so on. Fromm thinks that Maslow is right when he points out human life as an actualization of human potential, but he falsely neglects alternative possibilities in human nature. Fromm came to the conclusion that the humanistic movement might be too simple, that's quotation from, giving simple answers to existential questions by a mixture of psychoanalysis, group therapy, yoga, and other ingredients. Obviously, Fromm did not know what to do with practical humanistic psychology as it was done in group therapy and in counter groups. He said that he was very skeptical about group therapy because he would not like to speak about inner problems when 10 other people were present. Perhaps group therapy might be a chance for young people who have similar problems and are not very suffering, but it, quotation, can never be equivalent to psychoanalysis. Fromm added with a self-ironic wink that he was an individualist and somewhat old-fashioned. Erich Fromm's notes on Carl Rogers indicate a critical distance too, although there was some kind of companionship. In The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, Rogers is quoted as an opponent to Burroughs F. Skinner. We may conclude that Fromm regards him as an ally to his own criticism of behavioristic thinking. Sure, we can say that Fromm and Rogers had a great deal in common. For instance, they are thinking about the client's self-actualization and living therapeutic relation, but they did not know very much about each other. In his late lessons called Therapeutic Aspects of Psychoanalysis, Fromm says that client-centered therapy is a strange terminology because every therapy has to be client-centered. If the therapist is too narcissistic to be concentrating on the client's person, he should better give up his job. But this command fails to hit the heart of the matter. The question is in what way the therapist is centered on the client's person. I think that Fromm is mistaken when he says that, according to Rogers, the therapist should be like a mirror. In fact, the therapist shall answer by his own resonance, expressing the client's original feelings. Fromm, in contrast to Rogers, says that he hears something different from the client's saying that is unconscious and may be opposite to his accessible feelings. He makes use of dreams and associations to get into contact with the client's unconscious feelings, while Rogers is concentrated on feelings which are present here and now. Fromm's method seems to be more leading to interpretations, and Rogers' method is more emphatic. Point to discuss, I think. Woodcohn says that she never worked with a therapist who was more gifted to emotional understanding by his mere concentration on the client. Concluding remarks. In an article of the internet on humanistic psychology, I found a note on Fromm which seemed to fit him very well. The author writes that Fromm, quotation, saw himself as neo-Freudian in orientation, but he also occupied a key position on the periphery of the humanistic movement. Surely, Fromm never was in the center of the humanistic movement, but he really was in a key position on its periphery. I find it very good. There are three facts characteristic of Fromm's role as a precursor of humanistic psychology. First is transition from Freudian drive theory to Sullivan's interpersonal theory of human development and therapy. In the appendix of Escape from Freedom, Fromm made it very clear that human beings are primarily social beings and not secondarily dependent from others when they want their needs and drives to be satisfied. The second fact is that he had a concept of human growth and self-actualization which should be supported by interpersonal relations, and the third fact is that he called his fundamental assumptions a humanistic view in ethics and psychology. These positions are common to all humanistic psychologists, not only to psychoanalytic, and in psychoanalytics they are not so common. Fromm was the first one who brought them into a clear formulation. But Fromm did not maintain close ties with humanistic psychology. He underestimated, in my opinion, the potential of humanistic psychology because he was and remained a psychoanalyst. Fromm thought that psychoanalysis with some revisionist modifications was a better basis of therapy and superior to humanistic psychology. Finally, I want to tell you an anecdote of a discussion between Carl Rogers and Martin Buber at the University of Michigan in April 1957. Rogers said, "Man is basically good." This may be an interpretation of the whole his position and maybe the whole position of humanistic psychology. Buber added, "and evil," also good and evil. I think if Fromm would have been present at the discussion, he would have taken sides more with Buber and less with Rogers.